Game over, man. Game over.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
Why so serious?
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for November 6th, 2024, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us for this conversation, everybody. I am very much looking forward to getting into this film. I will note up front, as we are recording this, I noted on the main show this last week that I was pretty exhausted and wanted to give a fair warning up front that I might be struggling throughout that episode. I ended up getting through it better than expected.
Good.
However, for this episode and for the review that is to come next, I am now struggling for a different reason, but equally
I think
exhausted.
a lot of people are. And it's totally fair.
I have had a pretty challenging day, if I'm being perfectly honest. I have felt a hopelessness that I have maybe never felt before, and everything looks bleak. So I'm coming into this film, or into this conversation, with open arms in a lot of ways, because obviously we love movies. That's why we're here. That's why we do this each and every week, as we've done for the last 11 years, which is crazy to think about. It's been that long.
Sure. Yeah.
But there's so much joy that I get out of doing these conversations and talking about these movies that a lot of the time we love here on the show.
Yeah.
And this week, the reviews that we're discussing, not necessarily because of what they're about, but spoiler alert for both of them, I deeply love them both. I am huge fans of them. So there's a relief coming into this conversation.
There's a proper catharsis to counterbalance the other side of this conversation.
Exactly.
And I think that's what a lot of us need right now is that whatever that support system is for people, that's something we need to lean on now, right?
Absolutely. This will be cathartic. And that's ultimately where I was going with this. I am excited to dive into these films. I'm excited to talk about why I love them. And that is so needed for me at this moment in time. So,
Sure. Makes sense, man.
I hope everyone is okay. And I'm sure there's going to be a lot of discussion to be had over the next few months, given how this week has played out. But as it stands now, the despair that I'm feeling, like these films cannot have come at a better time. So let's go ahead and shift into a different man.
Let's bring a smile to that face of yours, JD, by talking about great movies.
Exactly. So this is a film from Aaron Schimberg, who wrote and directed this film.
Yeah.
And even though this isn't his directorial debut, I believe this is his second or third film. It's a filmmaker that I wasn't too familiar with.
Same. Kind of a discovery for us.
A discovery for us here at In Session Film for sure. This is an A24 film. It has Sebastian Stan in it. So there was a lot to look forward to, and the early buzz was really quite exciting. And maybe for reasons we'll get into, it exceeded the hype in many regards. So let's go ahead and jump into this. As I noted, it is written and directed by Aaron Schimberg. It stars Sebastian Stan, Renate Riensiv, Adam Pearson, and a few others that come and go, but it really is those three mostly throughout this film. If you're not familiar with A Different Man, an aspiring actor undergoes a radical medical procedure to transform his appearance, but his dream new face soon turns into a nightmare. All right, let's dig into this. Brendan, what did you think about A Different Man?
I can't help but laugh at that plot synopsis. I tweeted about a week ago when I watched this how much of a perfect double feature this could potentially make with The Substance, with Demi Moore, the Corioli Fergus film.
Sure.
And I think a few others, not even I know a few other of our colleagues in the film circle have made that comparison already. It's not something I can take credit for. In fact, it was our friend Jeff Zhang who actually made that comparison in his Letterboxd review. He said, "I love The Substance, but it's pretty clear now that Aaron Schimberg's A Different Man is the essential 2024 text on self-hatred and the self-wounding blade of wish fulfillment." I love that opening line of his Letterboxd review there. I think it really does sum up why this movie is really something special. It's not necessarily a film. I have to be careful how I say this. I was about to say I don't know if I fully enjoyed watching it because it does have a quality that's pretty haunting and pretty dire at times. But I will say it might be the smartest film that I've seen so far this year. It's one of those films that just has a multitude of layers of deconstruction happening sometimes simultaneously. Every character interaction, every scene has multiple layers you can peel apart that slowly reveal themselves and sometimes even contrast themselves. It's a really interesting thing. We'll talk about that with regard to some of these characters and the actions that they make and how that makes them really interesting characters for better and for worse. And I just find the layers to this thing really interesting. And much like The Substance as a tale of self-image and maybe in a weird way as another companion to a movie we'll also be talking about this week, The Remarkable Life of Evelyn, the way it deals with, self-respect and internalized respect, I think is also another talking point too, in a very different lens, mind you. But I think this is a really, really provocative movie that even stylistically, I can't really put my finger on it. It's kind of one of those movies that I think also goes beyond genre classification. Like it has elements of comedy and horror and obviously drama as well, if you want to try and create a very high level definition of what this film is going for. But it's also none of those things simultaneously. Like it's really hard to pinpoint. And sometimes my favorite movies are ones that you just cannot classify. And this is absolutely one of those films. Certainly one I'm going to be thinking about. Easily in my top 10 of the year so far. I don't know if it'll hold given the films we still have to see, but it's definitely up there for me.
Yeah, as I noted, I am a big fan of this, but I'm with you. I would even go as far as to say that it is one of the best movies of the year. Underneath its ghastly premise, it is this rich, captivating exploration of self-image and the mask that we wear. You can change your outward appearance all you want, all the way down to surgically changing your face, but that doesn't affect your internal ethos. At least that is the assertion that this film makes. And I think there's a lot of provocative nuance to that idea here as you're talking about, particularly the duality between desire and presumptuousness. I mean, it's understandable that Edward, our central character here, played by Sebastian Stan, that he would crave some sort of normalcy, given that at least externally, he might see himself as some sort of outsider because of how he looks. He does have neurofibromatosis, but once he goes through the procedure, it turns out that his loneliness, insecurity, and awkward demeanor isn't a result of his external look. Yeah, which is what I love about Oswald here, played by Adam Pearson.
Adam Pearson, so good here.
He's really great. He also suffers from neurofibromatosis, but he doesn't let that define him. Oswald is vibrant. He's amiable and charming. There's a warmth to him that is infectious, and that vividly affects others around him as they are clearly drawn to Oswald. The self-hatred that Edward displays here, in contrast to that, is vivid. But as we'll talk about more as this conversation goes, that is really only half of it, as we see Edward begin to exploit his transformation in disingenuous ways, which only fuels his insecurities all the more. And it is utterly fascinating the way this film begins to deconstruct all of that. I am completely with you there. And it is maybe most engrossing because of these performances. Sebastian Stan, I think, gives a career best performance in this film. There is a sorrow and humiliation in his eyes that is so palpable throughout this film. Much of it is internalized. His performance is very introspective, and the incessant discomfort he embodies is quite devastating. There are a few outbursts here, but a lot of it is the camera simply lingering on Sebastian Stan and how he taps into that awkward sorrow, that humiliation that he constantly reverberates here. It is really something to see as it unfolds, and it leaves you with just this incredible ending. I think it is one of the best endings of the year as well.
That is a striking conclusion. It really is.
Oh my gosh, it is. It is phenomenal. Yeah, I love this movie.
Yeah. I'll echo Sebastian Stan's performance here, and he has to do a lot of different things because given the plot synopsis that we laid out there is this procedure of sorts that changes his physical appearance to become Sebastian Stan, who we do normally view as a very good-looking man, right? So he's cast there for a reason, sort of a meta quality there, but he also has to give a performance as Edward prior to that change, that physical change, which is actually a very bold choice this movie makes. Given the way that Edward originally looks, it's very similar to Adam Pearson in real life, and I actually had a hard time determining if there was actually a difference between who was playing who and if there actually was genuine makeup work happening. Which if it was that,
I kind of wondered that. I didn't do any sort of research to know if that was the case or not. But there is a distinction between.
There is a difference, in mannerisms.
There is a
performance, and even in the looks. Like if it is makeup,
that's what I mean. Even in the looks,
and I think that's deliberate. And even if it is deliberate makeup work to try to mirror Adam Pearson himself, who will eventually get introduced as Oswald later in the film, that's a very bold choice. Like that is a very bold choice this movie makes. And I think that's really intriguing and continuing to dissect these layers even further and really deconstruct the way movies over the years have treated these types of people in real life. And now, this is not necessarily a movie about quote unquote disability specifically. We'll talk about the remarkable life of Evelyn later, which is a bit more direct in that regard. But I think the fundamental thesis is still mostly there. And whether that there's a possibility that people may just simply look at the disfigurement and the physical appearance first, as opposed to the person first. And that's what makes Ingrid, played by Renata Reinsva, really interesting here, because it raises a lot of questions as to whether her feelings toward both Edward and even Oswald in this play that she's writing are even genuine. Like there are questions there. So like you're sometimes on her side, then you think, wait, maybe I'm not, but I also am. And it really is complicated work. And I think that Aaron Schimberg does a really great job towing that line in a very delicate way.
I completely agree. And that's what makes Edward and Ingrid such fascinating characters here. With Edward, initially, while you certainly see the insecurity in the character, he is charming enough. He seems logical. There is hesitancy to go through with the surgery. He's not sure if it's the right thing to do. But once he goes through with it and realizes his handsomeness on the other side, that's when he changes his name and completely sheds his former identity for this Patrick Bateman type, but without the murder. And we realize that
loosely without the murder.
And we realize that without the mask, so to speak, Edward is actually a bit spiteful. Maybe he's not a great guy.
He's kind of a jerk at times. It's put it lightly.
He is. And I love how the film uses that as a catalyst to not just deconstruct the character as it relates to identity, but to your point, there's this additional layer that Schimberg poses a question that I find really fascinating in terms of assumed empathy. Now, I haven't seen his previous film, Chain for Life, but from what I've read, it does explore that idea of assumed empathy in others just because they might have some sort of deformity. And I think that is a big part of this film as well, because we probably do empathize with Edward early on and his deep sense of loneliness. But is it morally okay for us to exhibit immense pity simply because they are deformed? I don't know, but I do love how this film deconstructs that here with Edward, rendering our assumptions of him completely misguided, or at the very least, you do question that about yourself as it relates to this character and what defines him. And
That's
the
a
same
great
thing
point.
is absolutely can be said with Ingrid, obviously in a very different way, but initially she's the beautiful and very charming next door neighbor that shows kindness and is willing to pop over to Edward's apartment at any time. And maybe we think she's good because of the attention she gives Edward. She's kind to him. She's not, looking at him and gawking at him like we see with others there on the train there, for example. But soon we realize that she doesn't really have an interest in moving him beyond the friend zone. And we start to question how genuine she is with him, especially once we learn that she is exploiting Edward's life and self-hatred for her own artistic gains. So once again, our assumptions are dissected the more we learn about them. And that becomes more complicated later on in the film once Edward starts to show his true self, once that the Patrick Bateman comes out a little bit.
Absolutely.
Maybe she saw through the facade the whole time and saw him for what he is. I'm not sure, but I do love how the film goes about investigating that here. It is very complicated, very nuanced, and and how that affects the identity of these characters. It's really something to see.
Ingrid is a character, even to this point, having sat with the film for almost a week, I still don't know if her intentions were ever pure or not. I don't know. And I think that's what makes it fascinating. I think you can actually argue if the question is simply, were her intentions pure? Did she genuinely feel a connection with Edward at first, whether it was romantic or not? Did she feel at least some type of genuine kinship there? Or was it purely exploitative? The answer to that question is kind of just a simple yes all around. I feel like it could be all of the above to varying degrees, or maybe none of the above to varying degrees. And I just find that interesting. I think Renata Reinsver's performance is also great at tapping into that. She claims that she seems to recognize her own exploitative tendencies when making this play. At one point, she even says, and I wrote down the line, "I made Edward a victim. I fell into the obvious trap," which is what many movies also do. So there's a bit of a meta component there. But even though she's self-aware of that, does that also excuse the fact that she was exploitive in the first place? Has she forgiven herself? Has she actually moved beyond that? And of course, with Edward tapping into this Patrick Bateman-like mentality like you're talking about, that blurs the line even further, especially considering he ironically knows that he should be in this play because he literally was born to play this role that Ingrid has written, but he can't do it anymore. So this movie, we could talk about this movie for probably like 17 hours and we could dissect new things about
there's certainly a lot going on here. And I think an additional nuance to Ingrid and our allegiances with her, how that shifts throughout the film, because there is the exploitation of her taking his story to create this play. That is one element of it, right?
Yeah.
There's an additional layer to that, though, in that she thinks that Edward has died.
Yeah.
Because that's what she overhears. Once he goes through the transformation,
it's even more complicated. That's a great point.
He shows up to his apartment, and this isn't spoilers. This is fairly early on in the film, where he shows up to his apartment. of course, nobody recognizes him because he's gone through this surgical transformation and hasn't told anybody about it other than the doctors. So when one of the doctor's assistants shows up there and he says, "Oh yeah, Edward died," that's what she hears. So that adds another question of morality to
There's
her
a wrinkle there.
exploitation.
It's a huge wrinkle there. Yeah, it's moved.
Absolutely. And then
Such a wrinkly
to your
movie.
point, it's incredible. And to see Ingrid wrestle with the art as the film goes, it really is fascinating because at one point the play is a tragedy and then it shifts to, I guess without getting into too many spoilers, there's a comparable ending to Beauty and the Beast, and then it shifts again later on after that. And then in the final scenes of the film, when she's wrestling with what that meant to her all those years ago, now she has a completely different relationship to the material. So it is fascinating to see how that exploitation defines her and how she begins to evolve with it as the film goes. It feels like there's always something that doesn't agree with her that then forces her to pivot into who she's going to be as it relates to this material and these characters, of course, because Oswald and Edward are pivotal to a lot of this pivoting that she does throughout the film. And I do find that on its own terms fascinating, in addition to what we were saying earlier in terms of, do we think she's good in this, or do we think she's just as bad as Edward? There's a lot of duality to the character that I just find so incredible here.
Yeah, especially the way Edward starts to push back on Ingrid's artistic choices, because you think as Edward is now someone that did live this life. He no longer does, given his own choices, but some of the ways that he pushes back makes it seem like he doesn't really understand this lifestyle anymore. Like he's actually disassociated from it. It's really interesting and very ironic the way it treats that. And I want to also highlight something you said earlier that I think was a great point. The way that the film opens, we do feel genuine sympathy for Edward, but it's a great question asking, or the movie does a great job asking this question, whether we feel pity for him because of his loneliness, his soulfulness, or is it because of his physical attributes? And it makes us wrestle with that question. That's what makes the performance so good. But there is this added layer, and I love how Aaron Schimberg handles that, because in any other filmmaker's hands, it could have felt overly exploitative. The way that Edward is gawked at. There's a sequence at a diner or a restaurant where people are passing by, and every single person that passes by gives Edward a glance. One person very directly mocks him, but everyone's giving him a very brief glance. You can almost blink and miss it. There's something about the way that Aaron Schimberg chooses to capture that it doesn't ever feel exploitative in the wrong way. Because exploitation isn't like that on its face isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it can be, it can almost be weaponized if not handled as delicately as it should be. This never falls into that camp. I think it's handled with a lot of grace and a lot of sincerity. And clearly Aaron Schimberg had a passion for this material, maybe given his own upbringing and how he was able to channel that through this material.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with a lot of that. And it is a great transition into what I wanted to say as far as the film's themes on self-hatred, because I do think what you're talking about there, it very much tethers to this film and those ideas. The film's thesis on Edward's loathing and how that drives him to alter his appearance, believing that would lead to a better life, only for him to find out, or to find himself still struggling existentially. I do think that is fairly straightforward. It still carries weight with how it attacks social norms and even the fallout of the election, I think, is a big part of that as well. But the idea generally is unambiguous, even if sincere. The film's nuance, I think, is in Edward's desperate attempts for acceptance.
Yeah.
His success as a realtor clearly means something to him. He very much relishes in his coworkers complimenting him. And
Yeah.
once he finds himself in Ingrid's play, his ego manipulates him into thinking that this role was something he was always born to play, which, funny enough, isn't entirely untrue if you
Right,
look at
yeah.
it from a
It's-
practical point of view.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
is his life after all.
Yeah.
But the truth is that it gives Edward an opportunity to investigate his fractured identity. He puts on a mask for the play that is his face from before the procedure, a symbol of his self-hatred, something that allows him to hide from the audience. It becomes a barrier to protect him from unwanted judgment. He can simply exist as his former self, except this time it comes with acceptance from the audience. But it's all a facade because the mask shields him from fully engaging with any true self-acceptance. The brilliance of the film is that in Edward's attempt to hide from his self-hatred, he paradoxically confronts it more intensely given how things unfold with the play and his role shifting to something inconsequential, I'll say vaguely, without getting into too many spoilers. His desperation for acceptance is eventually the thing that withers him away in the end. And to me, that's where this film is perhaps most provocative. It is incredible. And when you insert Oswald into that as well, and the contrast between the two, as far as their convictions, how they feel about their identities, Oswald, as we noted earlier in our opening thoughts, is very self-confident. He wears his real face, not a mask, his real face proudly, with no judgment, no self-hatred whatsoever. He is the complete antithesis. And
I loved him.
How
I just wanted to hang out with him because he was just so charming. I like that
incredible.
karaoke scene was, I wanted to be there. I wanted to be there and actually have a drink with him.
I agree. But to finish that point real fast, like how that contrast interweaves itself into this dichotomy of fractured identities and how we feel about ourselves externally, how that manifests internally, I think is truly one of the most engrossing things I've seen this year. Like, there's so much to enjoy about this film as a drama, as a horror film, as a science fiction experiment. As you noted, it's really hard to pinpoint what this film is, and I do agree with that. But underneath all of that is this incredibly methodical and calculated thematic puzzle that has layers upon layers upon layers, and it is incredible to watch how it all unfolds.
Layers upon layers upon layers. I agree with that, but it never stifles or sacrifices the drama. We've seen movies that become more intellectual experiences than they are dramatic ones. We've talked about movies like that before, but this does have it both ways. It is still a very moving film on its face, but these layers are so compelling. And I don't know if this is hyperbolic to say. It's a very specific form of hyperbole. I think this film might have the best use of irony I've seen in film all year. Just given the notion how we keep talking about Edward being a man who was quote unquote born to play this character in Ingrid's play, but he technically isn't, right? I mean, like just because he physically was born to play this role doesn't mean he was really the right person for the job. And I think the film is very bold in tapping into that notion. His choice to have this procedure in the first place shows that lack of self-respect means he doesn't understand this type of persona all that much at all. And that's something we would normally associate with a man like him, just given the fact that he does have this deformity. So the film is very challenging in that regard, and twisting those perspectives that we as audience members may have. Like just because they live it doesn't mean that they always understand it. And there's more that they can learn. I think that's so fascinating.
Yeah, it's incredibly fascinating. And I think a lot of what you're saying there tethers, and I feel like we're talking in circles now, but that's because this film and its mechanics are fostering so many things simultaneously. But what you're talking about there wonderfully tethers to Ingrid and how she continues to evolve this play. That I think is fascinating once Oswald becomes a part of it. And you're right, even though it is about him and his experiences with Ingrid early on, it doesn't mean that he is right for the role.
Right.
And it comes down to that dichotomy that we mentioned earlier in terms of our external in contrast with the internal. He might be one of the most handsome men on the outside.
Yeah.
Sebastian Stan, great looking dude.
He's a great looking dude.
Great casting. Great casting. So yeah, externally he did manage to create a successful life for him because of that. You know, he has a nice apartment, great job, women if he wants. All of that is easily tangible for him. But internally, because of his insecurity and like his loneliness and awkward demeanor, none of that changes throughout this film. His internal ethos does not change. So that keeps him from digesting what the play is intended to be. And therefore, he can't really tap into the role. That's partially why he can't remember his lines. He can't really deliver the dialogue the way that Ingrid really needs for the play to succeed. And then you enter in Oswald and his eagerness and his vigorous energy.
You fall in love with him within 30 seconds, maybe even less than that.
You know, but that's ultimately why he is able to do the role more robustly. He's able to tap into that identity in a way that is necessary for that character.
Sure.
The self-hatred gets in the way for Edward, and yeah, I mean, it is such an interesting idea that even though it's his life and he experienced it firsthand, that doesn't mean on the other side of it, he can replicate it, because he can't. He doesn't know how to. Like, as I mentioned earlier, that paradox in him wearing mask, it keeps him from fully engaging with that self-acceptance, which, given how that play is intended to end, regardless, there's a couple of different endings, but that paradox is always going to keep him from being able to manifest that character the way it's needed. And as we see, Edward has a little bit of an implosion.
A little bit. He makes a few choices that, let's just say, there are consequences. They're pretty shocking. I feel like that's probably where the film maybe gets or turns maybe into a bit more of a literal. I don't even want to say literal horror film. It's because it never feels like a horror film, even though it has maybe some horror film like sequences. But they're not executed like a horror film would normally execute them. In fact, there's very little of any musical score to this movie. It's actually very static and kind of stoic in its filmmaking, which I did appreciate. It's really more of a script writing exercise and a performative piece that really emphasizes the film's strengths, even though I do think as a director, Aaron Schimberg is doing some great things with the camera, and that stoicism I mentioned earlier, I think is very effective in allowing the right things to shine. You know, it's interesting how this does work almost like a companion to The Substance from earlier this year, yet the executions for both of them could not be more different. Like, they really couldn't be. And that's not a knock on one over the other. I may have had a lot more fun watching The Substance, but it is a blunter object by comparison. And that's not a bad thing. It's just that's what that film is going for. You know, it's maybe a film that is a little easier to decipher despite the layers that are going on dramatically. But there are just different types of complex layers happening here with a different man that I feel like I can watch this film maybe 3 or 4 times, and it might feel like a new film every single time I watch it, which is perhaps the best thing I could say about any film, honestly.
For sure. And I understand the comparisons to The Substance as well. It's perhaps a little bit more noticeable. I don't know if that's the right word, but in terms of that idea of self-hatred and these dualities we create for ourselves, you insert the body horror element of as well, and the substance absolutely comes to mind. I do wonder though, I think, and this is completely coincidental on our end, we did not plan this at all.
Yeah,
but I do think
this
the
already.
Remarkable Life of Eibelin, as you noted, might be an even better comparison, because that is a film that also it features, its central character having a duality in terms of one life and existing in another, having a mask that he wears, so to speak, which we'll certainly get into. And then there's, of course, the how I feel externally. That's in contrast with how I feel internally.
Yeah.
All of that is at play in Eibelin as well. So, like, and even though that's a documentary, a lot of that film on a thematic level is very, very similar to A Different Man. You just, remove the body horror element and the sci-fi.
Well, that's why I mentioned earlier the comparisons and why I tried to be careful not to call this film, A Different Man, a movie about quote unquote disability specifically, because like I want to be careful with how we phrase those words. But they're like, when you look at it in a high level way about how people that maybe are hindered for whatever reason, even if it is internalized, how that leads to some self-hatred, how that leads to a lack of self-respect.
Exactly.
That is the comparison.
I completely agree. And that's why I phrase it internally in contrast to the externally.
Absolutely.
Because it is different. It isn't the same, obviously, but the way Edward feels in this film, and as we'll get into with Eibelin, the individual at the center of that film, the way he feels about himself externally also creates like self-hatred and perhaps a little bit of doubt that he then has to wrestle with. And he wears a completely different mask, but ultimately those two films are aiming at very similar goals.
Yeah.
And I do find that fascinating. And we'll talk about Eibelin here in a little bit, but
I mean, this has been a year. Yeah, this has been a year of double features. Now we have a triple feature.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Yeah. I do really love that about this film. And like, I just find it so fascinating, Oswald and how he enters this film, and not just the energy that he brings to it, but again, how he disrupts Edward in this completely unexpected way. I just find really, really fascinating, because I think this film, and where it could have fallen into a trap, like there's a version of this film that is much more simple-minded in its ideas of appearance, how we see ourselves on the outside, and how that creates this self-loathing.
Yeah.
That I like, there's nothing new about that idea. Obviously, that has been wrestled with many times in movies. But I think what is so fascinating here, again, is the mask that Edward very intentionally wears.
Yeah.
Even before Oswald becomes a part of it. The idea that
literal
he kept
and figurative
that
mask that this movie is using.
Like the literal and figurative mask. And then even though that's an element that might help him with the play initially, again, because it becomes this barrier that keeps Edward from finding that self-acceptance, once Oswald becomes a part of it, how that introduces these new layers and keeps Edward from fully realizing that fractured identity, like from him ever figuring that out. And if anything, it keeps those fractured identities all the more distant, even to the final shot of the movie. I think is really, like, to me, to echo something you said in your opening thoughts, that's where this film is very smart. You said that this was a very smart and clever movie, and that's where specifically I feel like this film is at its most intuitive. And it really is smart. I agree with that. It's incredible how Schimberg navigates those waters here.
Yeah, definitely one of our best movie discoveries for this year. And I agree with you. You said earlier that we haven't seen Schimberg's prior film, which also did feature Adam Pearson, as I know.
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard good things about it. I just haven't seen it. But
Mm-hmm.
this is certainly a movie that I think will start to garner some attention for him. I think.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how much work he'll get from this one. I think it depends on how many people gravitate towards it. I know it is getting some good reviews, but I'm not. I do wonder how a movie like this would work for general audiences when it becomes available on whatever platform. It's something I do wonder about because it does have a very methodical pace, a very methodical sensibility that, just tonally, just the energy of it might not work for everybody. But I think for those that are looking for something that's willing to have a dialogue with the audience almost in the moment. Like I felt like I was talking to this movie as I was watching it, which is a very rare thing. If you're looking for something like that, I don't think you'll be disappointed.
I completely agree. I also want to know, I know we've talked about Oswald, the character. Adam Pearson, the performer, is phenomenal here.
I think he's great.
He is really, really good. And not just as a charming figure who, as Brendan noted, you want to sit down and have a beer with. And I absolutely do echo that. But as a genuine supporting character here and what he means to this film, and like the conviction and the commitment he brings, and as someone who, has this physical appearance and it doesn't affect him at all.
Yeah.
Like the way he taps into that, I think is incredible. Like it's really great here. And it kind of emphasizes that deep loneliness in Sebastian Stan. Like those two characters just could not be more opposite of each other. Like they complement each other's performances impeccably, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Well, and you're right. And what I love about it too is that the writing never tries to make that dichotomy literal. Because I think in any other film that taps into this type of subject matter, at least any other film that's maybe made by lesser talented hands than someone like Aaron Schimberg, there would have probably been some type of scene, some type of exchange between Edward and Oswald, where Oswald actually has a moment of talking about his condition and how he's learned to overcome from it. Like there's no real moment like that in this movie, like where he like literally talks about his condition and how he chooses to live life to the fullest despite that. How he has learned to love himself. There's no literal definition of that feeling. But you can sense it in the performance, which is why the performance is so good. That's why I called this a performative piece earlier.
Yeah, and it really makes you question yourself again as it relates to that idea of assumed empathy. We look at Edward, he's lonely, people gawk at him, we empathize with him as a result. And then Oswald enters into the frame, and we never feel that way about Oswald because he doesn't ask us to.
Right.
So again, to go back to that, like, how are we supposed to feel about, the condition when, again, the film is very much trying to ask that question. Like, where does empathy begin and end? And should it even be there in the first place? What does it say about us that we just automatically gravitate toward it simply because of the condition, when Oswald doesn't need your pity at all? He doesn't want it. If anything, he just wants your friendship. He just wants to hang out. He wants to take you to dinner. He just wants to have a conversation with you. That's it.
Gosh, so many movies can learn from this one. They really can.
Oh, it's so good. Like, I just absolutely love.
This really is one of the best of the year. This is definitely top 5 material for me at this point.
Yeah. Do you have a thought about that final scene? I don't know if you want to get into any sort of specificity on it, but
no, I don't want to get into specifics. I don't. This is why I'm so excited to watch the movie again. I think it showcases a particular character that we may or may not have seen before in the movie, that may have also been the result of someone else's, I'll just say, death earlier on in the movie. I don't know if that was the case or not. I couldn't really tell. It was too quick of a cut to know if that was the same casting choice there or not. I think the character I'm talking about, the one at the restaurant that Edward has a very quick glance at. It almost seems to suggest that I guess the only way I can say it might sound a bit too specific. So hopefully this doesn't sound too spoilery, but I think it suggests how his view of what looks like a beautiful woman is sitting all by her lonesome, almost completely deconstructing his own journey in a way and how wrong that he was. And his reaction to that, I think, is just he can only react in the only way that he can think of. I think, if anything, that's maybe the point that it's trying to get across. But I also want to watch the movie again to see if I can decipher who that character was and if that was the same person that was the result of someone else's crystallization, I'll say earlier.
Yeah, I don't know. Honestly, I feel like I'd have to give it another go to be able to decipher that, I guess, more explicitly. I guess, like, where I just find it so moving in a way, again, it's the simple idea that Edward is a shadow of his former self.
Yeah.
And the irony of, like, getting this procedure done and thinking that it would become everything that
it would make him better. Yeah.
That would make him better. And on the other side of that, it has all of these devastating consequences. And look, I'll be perfectly honest with you. I think part of the reason that registers with me a lot today as we are recording this is given recent events.
Sure.
And I just find myself thinking about that a lot. I'll just say vaguely.
Okay. I think it's fair.
To politics here, but I just find that extremely hefty. And like I said, I think the final shot of this film is one of the best of the year. I think it's really great.
It's good. It's really good. Yeah, I'm with you.
Do you have any final thoughts on the film?
It's great. I feel like it is one of those movies I want to be careful with how much we talk about because there's so much we can uncover. But I think given our freshness on it, we've only seen it once. I've only seen it once. I think you've also only seen it the one time. We're at a point now where we have to prioritize films we haven't seen to do our proper research for the end of the year. I don't know if we have time to rewatch movies just yet. But I want to be careful with how much we try to dissect this movie because I know more may be revealed when we give it a second go sometime in the future. I don't want to try and overanalyze it too soon, even though that is the fun with movies. But this is a movie that does call for and require additional attention later on. And I can't wait to give it that.
Yeah, I completely agree. The last thing I'll just note here, we talked a lot about the performances and the writing and the thematic proficiency of the film. I do want to shout out Schimberg's direction here because I do think it is really great. You were talking about how this film is this exhilarating blend of all kinds of movies, and it is a pseudo body horror film. It's a dark comedy. It's sci-fi. It's romance. It's all of these things. It's really hard to pinpoint what the film is. It doesn't really fall into a box. And I do love how the film is able to like navigate those boundaries the way it does.
None of those things feel heightened, like it becomes that very genre thing, right?
Exactly.
Like the treatment of romance and drama and even body horror almost feels kind of passive in a way.
Yeah. It all feels of a piece. Seamless. Yeah. Like I love all of that about the film. And it works really great dramatically. I mean, there's a lot of these twists and turns, as we've been talking about, but like inside of all of that, Schimberg never loses sight of its central nucleus either, and the questions that he's, proposing here. And I don't think the film, maybe others do, but I don't think it ever resorts to, the film ever being tired or tropey as it relates to beauty and not being skin deep, as the phrase goes.
Yeah.
So, I think this is a really nuanced film that has some of the best performances of the year. And I know we talked a lot about the gentleman here, but Renee Taylor-Save is phenomenal here as well. She's really, really terrific.
She's very good. Yeah.
Yeah, that trio, really great. So,
yeah.
All right. Well, I think with all of that said, if you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here, you can leave a comment below. If you're watching on YouTube, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, reach out to us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky. I might find myself over there a little bit more in the next few months.
I should probably go there. I haven't signed up on Blue Sky yet.
Yeah.
I think it's about time.
I had the In Session Film account. I've had the In Session Film account for a while, but then I signed up with my own handle, like I do, like on Twitter.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm gonna be a little bit more active there. If you want to follow me, follow In Session Film on Blue Sky. We'll be active there. You can always hit us up on Letterboxd. You can email us insessionfilm@gmail.com. All right, so that is our review of A Different Man. Because of the week and everything that has happened, we are recording this a day later than we usually do. So what does that mean? Well, that means that this film is coming out first, hopefully in the morning.
Yeah.
But releasing the same day will be our second review of The Remarkable Life of Eibelin. So both of those reviews will come out the same day. So be on the lookout for that. If you're listening to this, it might be within the next hour, the next 10 minutes, the next 30 seconds. Who knows?
We're just going to bombard you with content.
Yeah, we're going to bombard you with content. So we'll have both of these reviews coming out today, and then in the next day or so, we'll have Chasing the Gold and Women in Session as well.
Yep.
Be sure to go and check out episode 609. We catch up with a few other films from 2024, including My Old Ass, which I loved, and Ghostlight, which I loved, and the documentary Music by John Williams. We talk about Interstellar because it just celebrated its 10th anniversary. Today, as this episode is released, happy 10 years to Interstellar, I guess.
I guess. We gotta stop talking about that movie. For a movie that you and I don't love, we talk about that one a lot.
It comes up. Well, people like to talk about Nolan and Interstellar. Yeah. It's just it's in the zeitgeist often.
Yeah, I love talking about Nolan, and weirdly, we talk about Interstellar more than his best films.
I know. We should really change that, shouldn't we?
Yeah. Let's talk about Memento again. I still think that's my favorite.
Good movie. Yeah, that's a great movie. I love that one a lot as well. All right. Well, with all of that said, be on the lookout for Eibelin and go check out episode 609. And we'll see you guys next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Sebastian Stan, Adam Pearson. At the Oscars. Both of them. Nominate them both.
Can't wait.